My mom took $500 to leave her medically fragile son with a stranger, then disappeared to reclaim her life. When I asked why she chose me, she said, "You looked desperate enough to need the money, but responsible enough to keep him alive." I just stared at her through the glass. That was a year ago. Last week, her son asked if he could call me mom. When was $500 not nearly enough? It started when this woman Claire knocked on my hotel room door looking frazzled and offered me $500 cash to watch her medically complex son Mason for an hour that night. She'd seen me working on my laptop in the lobby earlier and said I seemed responsible, and she was absolutely desperate because her regular nurse had just quit and she had a critical work presentation in the business center downstairs. Claire explained they were staying at the hotel while their house was being fumigated, and she just needed 1 hour to close this deal that would change their lives. She handed me $500 in cash up front, which seemed insane for 1 hour, then started explaining Mason's cystic fibrosis routine while he stood behind her looking thin but sweet with huge brown eyes. She showed me his nebulizer for breathing treatments and the vest machine for chest physiotherapy, promising she'd be back before his 7 o'clock medications. "His lungs are pretty clear today, so you shouldn't need to do anything," she said while Mason smiled at me shyly. "I'll be back by 7 sharp." Claire left a medical bag on my dresser with clear instructions taped to the top, apologizing 3 times for the short notice. Mason looked up at me and said in this tiny voice, "I'll be good, I promise." And I thought Claire was just an anxious special needs mom who needed a break. $500 for 1 hour of making sure a kid stayed safe seemed manageable, especially since I desperately needed the money. I was staying at the hotel because I had nowhere else to go. $500 could get me a room for a month. The first 30 minutes were fine because Mason was the sweetest kid I'd ever watched. He sat quietly coloring at the hotel desk, occasionally coughing into his elbow. He explained how he had to do treatments every day to breathe properly, speaking matter-of-factly about things no 8-year-old should have to understand. At 6:30, he reminded me his treatment was coming up soon, but I said don't worry, Mom would definitely be back by then. At 6:45, Claire texted, "Presentation running over, be there by 7:30 latest, so sorry." Mason saw my phone and said helpfully, "She packed extra medicine in case she was late," pointing to the medical bag. When I opened it to check, I expected maybe an extra dose or two, but inside were dozens of prescription bottles, all full, all with recent dates. There were antibiotics, pancreatic enzymes, bronchodilators, enough medication for at least a month. That seemed like over-preparing, but Claire was clearly an anxious mom. At 7:15, Claire texted again, "Client wants to see more numbers, 8 p.m., absolute latest. We'll add another $200. Mason was starting to cough more, so I looked for his nebulizer medicine in the bag and found not just one box, but cases of it, plus detailed instructions for every possible combination of symptoms. Under the medications was a binder with medical history, insurance cards, even his social security card. There were doctor's notes, specialist contacts at the Children's Hospital, and instructions for managing respiratory emergencies. My stomach started feeling weird, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong here, but I pushed it down and concentrated on taking care of this kid. At 7:45, I found a second suitcase behind the chair that Claire must have brought in earlier, full of medical equipment including a portable oxygen concentrator, backup nebulizers, the vest machine for chest physiotherapy, and boxes of supplements. Claire texted, "Almost done, 8:30 max," but the message came through as green instead of blue. Mason started coughing harder and said he really needed his treatment now, pointing to the nebulizer while I tried to figure out the dosage from Claire's overwhelming instructions. 8 o'clock arrived with me discovering an envelope in the medical supplies marked for Mason's guardian, and my hand started shaking before I even opened it. Inside were his birth certificate, medical power of attorney papers with blank spaces for a name, and a letter that started with, "I know this isn't fair to you." Claire sent another text, so sorry, definitely 9. I helped Mason with his nebulizer while my mind raced, trying to convince myself she was just really late. By 8:30, my texts weren't delivering, and when I called Claire's number, it was disconnected. I found her wallet in the medical bag with her ID and credit cards cut in half, like she'd destroyed her old life on purpose. Mason finished his breathing treatment and asked when Mom was coming back, and I didn't know what to tell him. When I called the front desk asking about reaching Claire in room 412, my voice was already shaking. The receptionist got quiet before saying, "Ma'am, room 412 checked out at 6:30. No one should be in that room. You need to leave right now." I started to explain that I couldn't leave, that I was stuck here with a kid who wasn't mine, whose mother had dropped off the face of the earth when Mason started coughing again, and then said in this tiny voice, "Mom said she couldn't watch me die slowly anymore, but that you looked like someone who could handle it." He reached for his vest machine, adding, "Can you help me? I need to do this every 4 hours or I can't breathe." I helped Mason get the vest machine working while my hands kept shaking because I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd just said. The machine made this loud thumping sound as it vibrated his chest to loosen the mucus in his lungs, and Mason just sat there calmly, like this was totally normal, while I tried not to panic. My phone was already in my hand, dialing 911 before I even realized what I was doing. The operator answered, and I started explaining about this woman abandoning her sick kid with me at the hotel, but she cut me off asking if the child was in immediate danger. I said no, but his mom left him here, and the operator said police would come, but warned me that since I'd accepted payment to watch him, I could be detained for questioning too. Mason heard me on the phone and started crying harder than I'd seen any kid cry, begging me not to let them take him to foster care because they wouldn't know how to do his treatments. I hung up anyway because what else could I do with this sick kid who wasn't mine? 20 minutes later, 2 officers showed up at my hotel room door and immediately separated us, one taking Mason to the corner, while the other started questioning me about how I knew Claire. Mason was coughing violently in the corner while trying to answer the officers' questions, and I kept telling them he needed his medicine, but they wouldn't listen. Detective Vasquez arrived about 10 minutes later and started going through all the medical supplies Claire had left, taking photos of everything while her face got more and more serious. She found the envelope with the legal documents and the letter from Claire and just shook her head while reading it. Mason's coughing got worse and turned into this horrible wheezing sound where he couldn't catch his breath. I yelled that he needed his nebulizer right now, but the officers said only medical professionals could give medication to a minor who wasn't family. Mason was gasping and turning red, and I finally screamed that I'd take full legal responsibility for whatever happened if they'd just let me help him breathe. Detective Vasquez looked at Mason struggling and nodded, letting me grab the nebulizer while she watched every move I made. I got the medicine measured out and the mask on Mason's face while the detective took photos of the whole process, documenting the medical supplies and asking me to explain each step. Mason's breathing slowly got better as the medicine worked, and the detective started asking him gentle questions about his mom, when she'd started acting different, if she'd said anything about leaving. He told her his mom had been crying a lot lately and selling their stuff, saying they were going on an adventure. The detective wrote everything down while Mason leaned against me, exhausted from the coughing fit. After his treatment finished, Mason fell asleep on my hotel bed while I sat at the desk giving my full statement to Detective Vasquez. She explained that without any legal relationship to Mason, Child Protective Services would have to place him in emergency foster care that night, and I felt my stomach drop thinking about him waking up somewhere strange without knowing how to help him. I asked if the foster family would know how to do his treatments, and the detective admitted she didn't know, that CPS would handle those details. That's when it hit me that no regular foster home would have any idea how to manage cystic fibrosis, and the medical equipment alone filled 2 huge suitcases. Detective Vasquez started making calls trying to find appropriate placement while Mason woke up crying for his mom, and I held him while she talked to supervisor after supervisor. Around midnight, we moved down to the hotel lobby because the detective needed to coordinate with CPS and didn't want to keep waking Mason. Bethany Torres from CPS showed up at 12:30, looking exhausted, and immediately understood how complicated this was when she saw all the medical equipment. She admitted they had no foster homes equipped for cystic fibrosis care and started calling medical foster agencies, but none of them had openings at 1 in the morning. Mason needed his 2 a.m. treatment, but Bethany said we had to follow protocol and get medical authorization before I could give him any medication since I wasn't his guardian. His breathing got more labored while we waited 45 minutes for an on-call pediatrician to call back and approve the treatment plan. The doctor finally called and authorized me to give the treatment under Bethany's supervision, so I helped Mason with his nebulizer while she took detailed notes on every step of the routine. Claire's behavior seems really strange here. Why pack enough medicine for a month if you're just going to a business meeting? The way she picked this person from the lobby feels odd too, like she was looking for someone specific. She watched me measure the medicine, attach the mask, time the treatment, and clean the equipment afterward, quietly admitting she'd never handled a medical abandonment this severe in her 15 years with CPS. The detective left around midnight and I barely slept, checking on Mason every hour while he tossed and turned in the hotel bed. At 6 in the morning, Bethany knocked softly, and we went down to the lobby with Claire's medical binder while Mason stayed sleeping. She flipped through page after page of hospital records, pointing out admission after admission to Children's Hospital with Dr. Samuel Park's name on most of them. The records showed Claire bringing Mason in for pneumonia 6 times last year, each stay lasting weeks, and Bethany noted how the discharge summaries mentioned Claire's increasing anxiety about his care. She found notes from social workers about Claire refusing respite care, insisting she could handle everything herself, even when nurses documented her falling asleep during Mason's treatments. At 8, the detective came back and pulled us aside in the lobby, showing us credit card records on her phone. Claire had bought a one-way ticket to San Jose, Costa Rica at 6:15 yesterday evening, right after she'd left Mason with me. The flight departed at 11 last night while I was still texting her, thinking she was in a meeting downstairs. Mason woke up then and came padding into the lobby in his pajamas, asking if his mom had called yet. I told him she was still busy with work stuff and he just nodded, used to disappointments, then reminded me his morning treatment was in 30 minutes. Back in the room, Bethany made phone calls while I helped Mason with his nebulizer, watching him breathe in the medicine like he'd done it 1,000 times before. At 10 o'clock, Bethany hung up and explained that no medical foster families were available for a child with Mason's level of care needs. She said protocol required admitting him to Children's Hospital for placement planning, which basically meant keeping him in the pediatric ward until they figured something out. Mason heard this and started shaking his head fast, backing away from Bethany toward me. Hospitals make me sicker, he said, his voice getting high and scared. I always catch stuff from other kids there, and Mom says my lungs can't handle it. Bethany looked uncomfortable, but said it was the only option since he needed round-the-clock medical supervision, and I wasn't certified for that level of care. I stepped forward and said I could keep taking care of him since I already knew his whole routine, and he was doing fine with me. The detective surprised me by backing me up, telling Bethany that Mason had been medically stable for the past 12 hours under my care. Bethany shook her head and explained I'd need emergency foster certification, which took weeks of background checks, home studies, and training classes. The detective pointed out that sending Mason to the hospital when he had appropriate care here seemed backwards, but Bethany said regulations were regulations. At noon, I helped Mason count out his enzyme pills while he explained he needed 6 capsules for a sandwich because of the fat content in the cheese and mayo. He knew exactly how many pills for every type of food, rattling off numbers for pizza, chicken nuggets, and mac and cheese like other kids know video game scores. After lunch, Bethany made more calls, and at 2 o'clock there was a knock on the door. A tall man with gray hair walked in, and Mason's whole face lit up as he ran over yelling, "Dr. Park!" The doctor hugged him and asked how his lungs were doing, then sat down to review all the medications Claire had left. He went through each bottle carefully, checking doses and expiration dates, nodding as he confirmed Claire had maintained perfect medical management despite everything else. He told Bethany that Claire had been an excellent medical parent, never missing appointments or treatments, which made this abandonment even more confusing. At 3, we all moved to the hotel's small conference room where Dr. Park pulled Bethany aside for a serious conversation. He explained that Mason was too medically fragile for standard foster care, requiring someone trained in airway clearance, medication management, and recognizing respiratory distress. He looked directly at me and said, temporary medical guardianship should go to someone already familiar with Mason's routine, someone he trusted, someone who'd successfully managed his care for the past day. Bethany immediately objected, listing regulations about background checks, home studies, and mandatory training periods that couldn't be waived. Dr. Park countered that Mason's medical needs trumped standard protocol, and keeping him stable was more important than following every bureaucratic rule. They went back and forth while Mason sat next to me, doing his afternoon breathing treatment with practiced movements. At 4 o'clock, a woman from CPS arrived with fingerprinting equipment, and I rolled my prints while Mason watched, curious about the ink. The detective had called in favors to fast-track my background check, promising results within hours instead of days. While we waited, Mason and I went back to the room for his afternoon vest therapy, the machine vibrating his chest to loosen mucus while he played games on my phone. At 6, the detective called with my background results. results, telling Bethany they found only my recent eviction and job loss from the restaurant closing. Nothing that disqualified me from emergency placement. We ordered room service, and Mason told me about his favorite video game while carefully taking his evening pills, mentioning casually that his mom used to cry during his treatments. She'd try to hide it, but I could see, he said, poking at his chicken. She said it wasn't fair that I had to work so hard just to breathe. He looked up at me with those huge brown eyes and asked if I was going to cry too. I promised him I'd be strong, that crying wouldn't help him breathe any better, and he smiled just a little. At 8, Bethany came back looking frustrated, carrying a stack of papers that needed a family court judge's signature for emergency placement. The problem was family court closed at 5 on Fridays and wouldn't reopen until Monday morning, meaning Mason would spend the entire weekend in the hospital unless we found an emergency judge. She'd already called 3 judges at home, but none would sign placement papers without a full hearing, and the emergency on-call judge only handled criminal matters. Dr. Park pulled out his phone and started scrolling through his contacts while Bethany kept checking her watch, and Mason played with the hospital bed controls. After a few minutes, Dr. Park's face lit up and he stepped into the hallway to make a call, gesturing through the window as he talked to someone. When he came back in, he said Judge Wells would see us at her house if we could get there by 10, which gave us less than an hour to drive across Denver with all of Mason's medical equipment. Bethany grabbed the portable oxygen tank while I packed the nebulizer and medications into a hospital bag, and Dr. Park helped Mason into a wheelchair even though he insisted he could walk. We loaded everything into Bethany's car, and I sat in the back with Mason, who was getting quieter, as we drove through the dark streets toward the judge's house in Cherry Hills. The house was huge with a circular driveway, and Mason's eyes went wide when we pulled up, but he started coughing hard from the stress, and I had to help him with his inhaler before we could go inside. Judge Wells answered the door herself, wearing jeans and a sweater instead of robes, and she led us into a living room where her husband was watching TV with their golden retriever. She sent Mason to sit with her husband while she took me and Bethany into her home office, closing the door behind us. For the next 30 minutes, she grilled me about everything from my employment history to my experience with children to why I was living in a hotel, and I could tell from her face that she wasn't happy about any of my answers. She kept asking how I could possibly manage a child with such complex medical needs when I couldn't even manage stable housing for myself, and I didn't have good answers except that Mason trusted me and the hospital would terrify him. Then she called Mason in and asked him to show her his medical routine, and he laid out all his medications on her desk, explaining what each one did and when he had to take it. He demonstrated how to use the nebulizer and the vest machine, talking about peak flow meters and lung function tests like a tiny medical student, and I saw the judge's expression soften as she watched him. When she asked if he felt safe with me, Mason looked her straight in the eye and said I was the only person besides his mom who knew how to help him breathe right, and that the hospital made him worse because the nurses there didn't listen when he told them something was wrong. The judge's husband brought in coffee and cookies while she reviewed the emergency custody paperwork, making notes in the margins and asking Bethany about placement options. At 11 o'clock, she signed the papers granting me temporary custody for 72 hours, but warned that this was highly unusual, and I'd need to prove at Tuesday's hearing that I could provide proper care. We drove back to the hotel in silence except for Mason's occasional coughs, and I carried him up to our room because he'd fallen asleep in the car from exhaustion. At 6 in the morning, I woke to Mason having a coughing fit that sounded different from his usual morning congestion, wet and rattling in a way that made my chest tight with worry. I fumbled through Claire's binder looking for the morning routine, which turned out to be way more complicated than the evening treatments, with 3 different medications that had to be given in a specific order with exact timing between them. Why did Claire pick me specifically when she must have known other people at the hotel? The way Mason knows his exact pill counts for different foods makes me wonder how long he's been managing his own care. Mason guided me through mixing the medications while coughing between instructions, and I had to stop twice to let him catch his breath before we could continue. The vest machine had to run for 30 minutes instead of 20, and there were extra supplements that needed to be crushed and mixed with applesauce because he couldn't swallow pills when his throat was this inflamed. By the time we finished, it was almost 8, and Mason was exhausted again, curling up on the bed while I cleaned the equipment and worried about whether I was doing any of this right. At 9, Bethany showed up looking frazzled with her phone in her hand, and before I could stop her, she was showing me a Facebook post that had apparently gone viral overnight. Claire had posted this long manifesto about how society expected mothers to sacrifice everything for sick children, and how she was reclaiming her life from medical slavery, complete with pictures of her on a beach somewhere looking happy and free. Mason saw the screen before Bethany could hide it, and his face just crumpled as he read his mom's words about being liberated from the burden of his illness. He pushed away his breathing treatment and said maybe mom was right and he was too much trouble for anyone, that maybe it would be better if he just stopped taking all the medicine and let whatever happened happen. I had to physically hold the nebulizer mask to his face while he sobbed about being a burden, telling him over and over that he wasn't too much trouble while Bethany called Dr. Park in a panic. It took an hour to get him through the full treatment because he kept pulling away and saying he didn't deserve all this help, and I could hear his breathing getting worse with each sob. Dr. Park showed up at 2 with his medical bag and a worried expression, listening to Mason's lungs for a long time before adjusting his medication doses. He pulled me aside while Mason dozed and explained that emotional distress could trigger serious complications with CF, that Mason's lung function had dropped 5% just from the stress of the last few days. He wrote new prescriptions and adjusted the treatment schedule, adding an extra breathing treatment in the afternoon and increasing one of the antibiotics. While he was packing up his bag, Detective Vasquez called to tell me they'd traced Claire's financial records and discovered she'd emptied Mason's medical trust fund 3 days before abandoning him. The account had contained $47,000 from a settlement when Mason was diagnosed, money specifically set aside for his medical care, and Claire had withdrawn every penny. The $500 she'd given me was literally all that was left of Mason's money, and I sat there staring at the cash in my wallet, realizing it wouldn't even cover one prescription refill. Detective Vasquez said they were building a case for abandonment and fraud, but that wouldn't help with Mason's immediate needs, and I could hear her frustration through the phone about how Claire had planned this so carefully. Around 6, the hotel manager knocked on our door with an eviction notice, explaining that Claire's credit card had been declined for the room charges, and they couldn't accept cash payment without proper identification. Mason heard the whole conversation from the bed and started hyperventilating about being homeless, his breathing getting so bad I had to give him an emergency emergency inhaler dose while the manager stood there looking uncomfortable. The manager shifted his weight and said we had 30 minutes to pack before security would escort us out, then left while Mason wheezed into the inhaler mask with tears running down his face. I grabbed my phone to call Dr. Park but realized it was already past 7 when someone knocked hard on the door and a woman's voice called out that she was Linda Smith from Hospital Social Services. She pushed past me into the room carrying a folder thick with papers, took one look at Mason struggling to breathe, and immediately called Dr. Park on her cell while pulling emergency housing vouchers from her bag. Within 20 minutes, she had Dr. Park agreeing to admit Mason for respiratory evaluation, which would qualify us for Ronald McDonald House placement, and the hotel manager backed off when she flashed her hospital credentials and mentioned legal liability for evicting a sick child. Mason's breathing stabilized enough for him to pack his dinosaur backpack while I started cramming medical supplies into the hotel laundry bags since we didn't have enough suitcases. Linda helped me organize the medications by dosing schedule, filling 3 large bags just with pills, nebulizer solutions, and enzyme capsules that had to be refrigerated. The vest machine alone took up an entire suitcase, plus the backup nebulizer, the peak flow meter, the pulse oximeter, and boxes of supplements Claire had stockpiled like she was preparing for the apocalypse. By midnight, we were in Dr. Park's emergency exam room at Children's Hospital, where Mason demonstrated his peak flow numbers and pretended not to understand. This was all paperwork gymnastics to get us housing. The admission papers listed respiratory evaluation and medication adjustment as the official reasons while Linda processed our Ronald McDonald House application in the hallway, occasionally poking her head in to ask about insurance numbers I didn't have. Mason fell asleep on the exam table clutching his stuffed T-Rex while nurses prepared a bed in the CF ward, his thin chest rising and falling in the practiced rhythm of someone who'd learned to breathe deliberately. The next morning, I woke up in the parent cot beside Mason's hospital bed to find Linda already there with more paperwork, explaining that we'd been approved for a room at Ronald McDonald House, but Mason needed to stay admitted for at least 48 hours for insurance purposes. She helped me wheel 3 carts of medical supplies down to the family resource room, where other parents stared at the sheer volume of medications one small boy required to stay alive. Around noon, I was organizing his breathing treatments by time when a woman in the hallway started yelling Mason's name, and before I could react, she burst into our room screaming about Claire being evil and selfish, and how could she abandon her baby like this? The woman's face was red and twisted with rage as she pointed at Mason cowering in his bed, shouting that Claire was a monster who didn't deserve a child when so many CF parents would die for their kids. 2 security guards had to physically drag her out while she kept screaming about how the CF community would never forgive Claire, and Mason pulled his blanket over his head, shaking so hard his IV alarm started beeping. Linda came running when she heard the commotion and spent an hour doing damage control, explaining to Mason that people sometimes said mean things when they were scared and hurt, while I held his hand and felt my chest getting tight with anger at this stranger traumatizing an already traumatized kid. That afternoon, Linda sat with us while Mason did his vest treatment, the machine vibrating his chest to loosen mucus while she helped me fill out temporary guardian paperwork that felt surreal to sign. She mentioned casually that Claire had been trying to get Mason into residential care for months, but kept getting denied because he wasn't sick enough yet, which made my stomach turn thinking about a mother waiting for her child to deteriorate enough to qualify for help. Mason finished his treatment and asked if we could eat dinner in the cafeteria like normal people, so we walked down to find a table among other medical families picking at overpriced sandwiches. He taught me how to calculate his enzyme dose based on fat grams, proudly showing off his multiplication skills while explaining that he needed 3 capsules for a grilled cheese and 2 for apple juice, and my heart broke watching this 8-year-old do medical math most adults couldn't handle. The next morning started with Linda calling to say the custody hearing scheduled for Tuesday had been postponed because Claire's parents had hired a lawyer and were flying in from Florida to seek custody. My hands started shaking as she explained they hadn't seen Mason in 3 years, but grandparent rights were strong in Colorado, especially when the parents were absent. I was still processing this when Bethany arrived at the hospital to explain that biological family usually got preference even if they were strangers to the child, and courts often ignored practical concerns about medical care in favor of blood relations. Mason overheard everything from his bed and started crying that he didn't want to go live with people he didn't remember, begging me not to let them take him to Florida away from his doctors and his life. That afternoon, while waiting for discharge paperwork at Ronald McDonald House, Mason pulled out his mom's phone she'd left in the medical bag and showed me a video she'd recorded the night she left. Claire's face filled the screen, puffy and red from crying, explaining how she loved Mason more than life, but had nothing left inside after years of watching him suffer and fight for every breath. She talked about the guilt of resenting her own child's needs, the exhaustion that went bone deep, the way she'd started fantasizing about car accidents just to make it stop, and how she knew leaving made her a monster, but staying would have made her worse. Mason watched his mother apologize for being weak and empty, for not being the warrior mom he deserved, while I sat there thinking about the impossible weight of keeping another human alive through sheer willpower. Dr. Park found us there and handed me a letter he'd written for the court about Mason's complex medical needs and my demonstrated competence in managing them, noting that his grandparents were both in their 70s, which could impact their ability to perform the physical therapy required for his daily treatments. Something feels off about Linda showing up exactly when they needed her most. Social services doesn't usually work that fast, especially after 7 at night when Mason was about to be homeless. The next morning at 9 sharp, the grandparents' lawyer burst into the emergency hearing demanding I be removed as Mason's guardian, immediately since I was just some random stranger who'd been paid to watch him for an hour and was now trying to profit from their family tragedy. He waved papers at the judge claiming they had proof I was unfit and that Mason needed to be on a plane to Florida by noon, where his real family could take proper care of him. The judge looked through the stack of documents while Mason sat next to me breathing shallow and fast through his morning treatment that I'd started at 6:30 like always. 2 hours later, Judge Wells ordered both sides to submit to home studies within 48 hours and said she was maintaining my temporary custody for 2 more weeks while the court investigated what was best for Mason. The grandparents' lawyer slammed his briefcase shut and stormed out while Bethany squeezed my shoulder and said we'd gotten more time than she expected. That afternoon, Mason finally had his first completely stable day since the hotel, his oxygen levels staying above 95%, while we settled into our room at Ronald McDonald House where other families dealing with sick kids, didn't stare at us or whisper about the abandonment case they'd seen on the news. A mom whose daughter had leukemia showed me where the good coffee was hidden, and another dad taught Mason a card game while his own son got dialysis down the hall. The next morning, Detective Vasquez called to tell me she'd tracked Claire to a wellness resort in Costa Rica, where she was posting Instagram photos of herself doing yoga on the beach with captions about healing from trauma and finding her authentic self. Each post had hundreds of comments calling her a monster and saying she deserved prison, but Claire kept posting sunrise meditation photos like she didn't have a care in the world. The day after that, everything fell apart when Mason's grandfather called the Ronald McDonald house phone demanding to speak to his grandson, and before I could stop it, Mason had grabbed the receiver eager to talk to family. I heard the old man's voice getting louder through the phone as he told Mason this was all his fault, that his constant sickness and neediness had driven his mother away, that he was a burden who destroyed everything he touched. Mason's face crumpled as his grandfather kept going, saying Claire would still be here if Mason hadn't been so demanding with all his treatments and doctor visits and special needs. I grabbed the phone and hung up, but the damage was done because Mason pushed away his nebulizer and said he didn't want to do his treatment anymore, since all he did was make people leave. Linda rushed over when I called her and arranged an emergency therapy session with a child psychologist who specialized in kids with medical trauma. Mason sat at a little table drawing while the therapist asked gentle questions, and my heart broke when I saw his pictures, all of them showing himself as a black scribbled monster with other stick figures running away from him. The therapist said it would take time to undo what his grandfather had said, but she'd work with Mason twice a week if the court approved it. The next morning, I went to a CF parent education class at the hospital to learn more about managing Mason's long-term care, and the instructor mentioned offhand that she remembered Claire from these same classes, how she'd attended them dozens of times over the years, always taking notes and asking questions like she was trying to be the perfect CF mom. The other parents in the class looked at me with sympathy when they heard I was Mason's emergency guardian, one mom whispering that she couldn't imagine abandoning her son no matter how hard it got. 2 days later, the report from the Florida home study came in, and it was worse than anyone expected because the grandparents lived 90 minutes from the nearest CF center, had no medical equipment set up, and the grandfather's medical records showed he'd been diagnosed with early-stage dementia 6 months ago. Despite all of this, the grandparents' lawyer stood up in court the next morning arguing that blood relations were more important than anything else, and that Mason belonged with his real family, not some unemployed stranger who'd known him less than 2 weeks. Judge Wells seemed to actually consider his argument, asking about my employment status and financial situation, while I tried not to panic about losing Mason to people who couldn't even manage his basic medical needs. Mason testified through a video link from a court advocate's office, sobbing as he explained his daily routine of treatments and medications, and begging the judge to let him stay with me because I was the only person who hadn't left him or told him he was too much trouble. Judge Wells watched him cry on the screen, then announced she was appointing a guardian ad litem to represent Mason's best interests, since clearly the adults in his life couldn't agree on what those were. The guardian ad litem showed up at Ronald McDonald House 3 days later with a clipboard and spent the entire afternoon watching me manage Mason's treatment schedule. She was this retired pediatric nurse named Margaret, who took notes on everything from how I measured his medications to the way Mason relaxed when I helped him with his vest therapy. Margaret stayed for 6 hours total, watching me prepare his enzymes before meals, set up his nebulizer treatments, and help him through 2 rounds of chest physiotherapy, while Mason chatted with her about his favorite video games between coughing fits. She documented how Mason would grab my hand during the harder breathing treatments, and how I'd learned to distract him with stories about made-up adventures while the vest machine shook his tiny chest. Margaret watched me clean and sterilize all his equipment, organize his 17 different medications by time and dosage, and she saw Mason fall asleep against my shoulder after his evening treatment while I rubbed his back until his breathing steadied. The next morning, Linda called to warn me that reporters were asking questions at the hospital after Mason's grandparents had given an interview to Channel 9, calling me a stranger who was keeping their grandson from them. Within hours, my phone was ringing non-stop with reporters wanting my side of the story, and the Ronald McDonald House staff had to start screening visitors after 2 news vans parked outside. I kept Mason inside all day, but the next afternoon we had to go to the hospital for his regular checkup, and the moment we stepped out the door, 3 reporters rushed us with cameras and microphones. Mason started hyperventilating immediately, his face going pale as they shouted questions about his mother and whether I was getting paid to keep him, and his oxygen monitor started screaming as his levels dropped below 80. I scooped him up and ran back inside where the staff called an ambulance while Mason wheezed against my chest, his lips turning blue despite the emergency inhaler I gave him. The paramedics got him stabilized with high-flow oxygen, but we still had to go to the emergency room where Dr. Park found us and went absolutely ballistic when he heard what happened. He banned all media from hospital property that same day and spent 2 hours writing this detailed letter about how the stress from the reporters had triggered Mason's worst breathing crisis in weeks and could have killed him. Dr. Park submitted the letter directly to Judge Wells, along with Mason's oxygen readings and emergency room records, showing exactly how dangerous the media ambush had been for someone with his condition. The next morning, Linda showed up with stacks of paperwork for disability benefits and food assistance, sitting with me for 3 hours to fill out every form while Mason did his morning treatments. The paperwork was overwhelming with questions about income, assets, medical history, and future care plans, but Linda guided me through each section, making sure I understood what benefits Mason qualified for and how to maintain them. She helped me apply for Social Security disability on Mason's behalf, emergency food stamps, and even connected me with a program that would help pay for his medications if the insurance ever lapsed. 2 days later, I was helping Mason with his afternoon vest therapy when the Ronald McDonald House manager knocked urgently, saying Mason's grandparents were in the lobby demanding to see him. I could hear the grandfather shouting from down the hall about his rights as family, while the staff tried to explain that they needed court permission for any visits. The manager asked if I wanted to call the police, and I said yes because the grandfather sounded drunk or confused, yelling about taking Mason home right now and how dare strangers keep his grandson from him. Security arrived first, but the grandfather shoved past them trying to get to the elevator, screaming that he'd kill anyone who tried to stop him from seeing his grandson. The police showed up within minutes and had to physically restrain him while he swung at them, still yelling incoherently about kidnappers and thieves stealing his family. The grandmother stood there crying and trying to calm him down, but he didn't seem to recognize her either, calling her by the wrong name and asking where his son was. The police report documented his confusion and aggression, noting that he appeared disoriented and possibly suffering from dementia, which supported exactly what we'd been telling the court about their inability to care for Mason. The grandmother broke down completely after they took him to the hospital for evaluation, admitting to the officers that he'd been getting worse for months, and she couldn't handle Mason's medical needs alone. She told them she hadn't slept more than 3 hours at a time in weeks because she was terrified of missing one of Mason's treatments or giving him the wrong medication dose. The grandfather's dementia diagnosis from 6 months ago makes me wonder why nobody mentioned this earlier when they first tried to get custody. That's a pretty important detail to leave out until the home study. The next day, Mason and I stayed in our room doing puzzles and watching movies between his treatments, both of us exhausted from the chaos of the past week. Mason asked me while we were working on a dinosaur puzzle if I was going to keep him forever, and I couldn't lie to him, so I just said I'd try my best to take care of him as long as I could. He nodded like he understood and went back to finding puzzle pieces, but he scooted closer to me on the bed and stayed pressed against my side for the rest of the day. The Guardian ad litem submitted her report the next afternoon, strongly recommending that I maintain custody of Mason, citing my competence with his medical care and the clear emotional bond between us. Margaret's report included detailed observations about Mason's comfort level with me, my ability to manage his complex treatment schedule, and her professional opinion that removing him from my care would be detrimental to his health. The grandparent's lawyer immediately requested a second evaluation, claiming bias, but Judge Wells denied it based on Margaret's credentials and the grandfather's documented issues. That same morning, Detective Vasquez called to tell me Claire had posted a video on social media from Costa Rica announcing she was coming back to reclaim her son from the strangers who'd stolen him. In the video, Claire looked tanned and rested, talking about how she'd been forced to leave for her safety, but was ready to fight for her child, completely ignoring the fact that she'd abandoned him in a hotel room with a stranger. Detective Vasquez said she was preparing an arrest warrant for child abandonment and would have officers waiting at every major airport in case Claire actually tried to return. 3 days later at Mason's therapy appointment, the therapist pulled up Claire's video on her tablet, and Mason's whole body went stiff when he saw his mom's face on the screen. He watched her talk about being forced to leave for her safety, and his hands started shaking so bad I had to hold them. The therapist paused the video and asked Mason how he felt, but he just stared at the frozen image of his mom looking healthy and tanned. After a few minutes, he whispered that he wanted her back but was scared she'd leave again. The therapist worked with him for the next hour on abandonment trauma, while I sat there watching this kid try to process something no 8-year-old should have to understand. The next morning, I finally caught a break when a company called about the remote data entry application I'd submitted weeks ago. They offered me 20 hours a week that I could do from anywhere with flexible scheduling around Mason's treatments. The pay wasn't great, but it was real income for the first time since this whole mess started. I set up my laptop at the Ronald McDonald House while Mason did his morning nebulizer treatment and started entering medical billing codes. The work was boring, but I could pause whenever Mason needed his vest therapy or had a coughing fit. That afternoon, Bethany came for her final home visit before the custody hearing and walked through our room at the Ronald McDonald House taking notes. She checked that Mason's medications were organized and his equipment was set up properly near his bed. She watched me help him with his afternoon treatment and saw how we'd gotten into a routine with his care. Before she left, she told me she'd never seen someone step up like I had for a kid who wasn't even theirs. The custody hearing started at 9 the next morning with Mason's grandparents and their lawyer sitting across from us in the courtroom. Their lawyer stood up and argued that I was still technically homeless since the Ronald McDonald House was temporary housing. He pointed out I'd only had a job for 2 days and had no family support system or experience raising a child. The grandparents sat there nodding while he talked about how they had a stable home and could provide for Mason properly. When it was our turn, our court-appointed lawyer called Dr. Park to testify about Mason's medical needs. Dr. Park explained how I'd learned every aspect of Mason's complex treatment routine in just a few weeks. He told the judge that Mason's lung function had actually improved since he'd been in my care. Then he said clearly that disrupting Mason's stability now by moving him to Florida could trigger a serious decline in his condition. The judge asked him if he believed I was capable of managing Mason's medical needs long-term, and he said yes without hesitation. After lunch, the grandmother suddenly stood up while her lawyer was talking and said she needed to speak. She looked at Mason and then at me and said she couldn't do to him what her daughter had done. She told the judge they were withdrawing their petition for custody because Mason needed stability more than anything. Her husband looked confused and asked where Claire was, like he'd forgotten she'd abandoned Mason. The grandmother had to remind him that Claire was gone, and they were in court about Mason's custody. Judge Wells called a recess to let the grandparents' lawyer figure out what was happening, but when we came back, they confirmed they were withdrawing. The judge then granted me temporary legal guardianship for 6 months with the possibility of permanence if Claire didn't return. Mason ran over and hugged me right there in the courtroom while the bailiff tried not to smile. The next morning, we started figuring out our new life with actual legal security for the first time. I enrolled Mason in the elementary school near the Ronald McDonald House and got him on my employer's health insurance. We set up a regular therapy schedule, and I learned how to navigate the special education system for his needs. Mason started to relax in a way I hadn't seen before, like he finally believed he wasn't going to be moved again. That afternoon, Detective Vasquez called with news that made my stomach drop all over again. Claire had been detained at Miami International Airport trying to fly back to Denver from the Bahamas. She was in custody pending extradition back to Colorado to face child abandonment charges. The detective said Claire was claiming she'd had a mental breakdown and never meant to leave Mason permanently. The next morning, Mason came to me during his breathing treatment and asked if he could visit his mom in jail. His therapist had apparently told him it might help with closure, but I was scared it would undo all his progress. Mason looked at me with those huge brown eyes and said he needed to ask her why she left him with a stranger. The next morning, I drove Mason to the county jail with my hands shaking on the steering wheel while he sat quietly holding his breathing treatment bag. The visitor room had thick glass between us, and the metal chairs where we waited made Mason look even smaller than usual. Claire came in wearing orange and started crying the second she saw Mason, who just stared at her through the glass. She picked up the phone on her side, and I held ours so Mason could hear while she kept saying she was sorry over and over. Mason asked why she left him, and Claire broke down completely, admitting she'd been planning it for months after researching safe surrender surrender laws, but hotels didn't count. She said she picked me because I looked kind and desperate enough to need the money, but responsible enough to keep him safe. Mason listened without saying anything, while Claire explained how she couldn't watch him get sicker every day and how the medical bills had destroyed everything. The visit lasted 20 minutes before Mason said he wanted to leave, and we walked out while Claire was still crying behind the glass. The next day, his therapist spent 2 hours with him working through the visit, and Mason finally admitted he was mad at his mom, but also glad she was alive. He drew pictures of the jail and his mom in orange while the therapist helped him understand that none of this was his fault. 2 days later, Linda from the hospital came to our motel room with stacks of paperwork for housing assistance and Mason's social security benefits. She sat at the little table showing me how to fill out each form while Mason did his vest treatment in the corner. The housing voucher would get us a real apartment near the hospital, and the benefits would cover Mason's medical supplies. Linda stayed 3 hours making sure every line was perfect and promised to walk the applications through herself. 4 days after that, Claire's public defender called saying Claire would plead guilty if I'd support a minimum sentence recommendation. The prosecutor wanted 5 years for child abandonment, but the defender thought they could get probation with mental health treatment if I testified about Claire's breakdown. I told him I needed to think about it while Mason colored at the desk pretending not to listen. That afternoon, Mason asked if he could write a letter to the judge and spent 2 hours working on it at the motel desk. His handwriting was shaky, but he wrote that he loved his mom but felt safer with me now and wanted to stay with me even after she got out. He drew a picture of his lungs at the bottom to show why he needed so much medicine and signed it with a smiley face. The next morning, we moved into a subsidized 2-bedroom apartment 4 blocks from Children's Hospital, with Linda helping us carry boxes. Mason got his own room for the first time in months and immediately started taping up cystic fibrosis awareness posters the hospital had given him. He arranged his medicine on a special shelf and put his vest machine by the window where he could watch kids playing while doing treatments. 3 days before the sentencing hearing, Mason's therapist spent extra time preparing him for different outcomes. Mason decided he wanted to go to say goodbye properly, and the therapist helped him practice what he might want to say. The morning of sentencing, we sat in the back row of the courtroom while Claire stood in front of the judge reading a statement about caregiver burnout. Mason's letter to the judge feels like something his therapist coached him through. Kids don't usually think to draw their lungs at the bottom of court documents. Claire's research into safe surrender laws before abandoning him shows this wasn't the desperate split-second decision she talked about watching Mason struggle to breathe every night and how she'd spent his college fund on medical bills and couldn't afford his new lung medication. The judge kept rubbing her forehead while Claire explained how she'd had a complete mental breakdown and never meant to abandon him permanently. The prosecutor showed pictures of the medical supplies Claire had left and pointed out she'd clearly planned everything in advance. After 2 hours of arguments, the judge said she understood caregiver burnout but couldn't ignore the planning involved in the abandonment. She sentenced Claire to 2 years with possibility of parole in 1 year if she completed mental health treatment and parenting classes. Mason cried quietly beside me, but seemed relieved to finally know what would happen. The next day, I enrolled Mason at the elementary school near our apartment with a 504 plan for his medical needs. The school nurse learned his treatment schedule, and they put him in a classroom near the health office for quick access during breathing problems. At lunch, a kid named Matthew sat with Mason and didn't even blink when Mason had to use his inhaler between bites. Matthew asked if Mason wanted to trade Pokemon cards after school, and Mason smiled bigger than I'd seen in weeks. 2 weeks later, I sat in a conference room at the county building with 12 other people taking foster parent classes, while Mason stayed with the after-school program. The instructor passed around packets about trauma responses and attachment disorders, while a woman next to me whispered that her nephew had shown up at her door 3 months ago. Another man talked about his daughter's best friend who'd been sleeping on their couch for 6 weeks before they realized the kid's parents had moved away. Everyone had these stories about kids who just needed someone to step up. I signed papers and got fingerprinted again, and filled out forms about my apartment's square footage and fire exits. Mason drew pictures in the waiting room while I took the CPR certification test and learned about mandatory reporting requirements. The social worker stamped my certificate and said I was officially approved as his foster parent, which meant more money each month for his care and legal standing to make medical decisions. That Tuesday morning, Mason woke up with a fever of 103, and his cough sounded wet and heavy in his chest. I drove him straight to the emergency room where they took one look at his medical history and admitted him immediately. The triage nurse recognized us from our previous visits and fast-tracked us to a room while I filled out insurance forms with my new guardian status. Mason's oxygen levels dropped to 88, and they put him on supplemental oxygen while starting IV antibiotics. Dr. Park arrived within an hour and ordered chest x-rays that showed pneumonia in his lower left lobe. I signed consent forms for the aggressive treatment protocol while Mason dozed between breathing treatments. The respiratory therapist came every 4 hours to do his vest therapy, and I learned how to read the monitors showing his oxygen saturation and heart rate. On the second day, Mason looked at the nurse adjusting his IV and said, "That's my real mom now," pointing at me. The nurse smiled and updated the chart while I excused myself to the bathroom where I sat on the closed toilet lid and cried for 5 minutes. When I came back, Mason was coloring in a book the child life specialist had brought him. His breathing improved steadily with the IV antibiotics, and by day 3, his fever broke completely. Dr. Park reviewed his charts and mentioned that Mason's baseline lung function had actually improved since I'd been caring for him. The consistent treatment schedule and stable housing were making a real difference in his overall health. He'd gained 4 pounds, and his color looked better than when I'd first met him at the hotel. The nutritionist noted he was finally getting enough calories with the pancreatic enzymes taken properly with every meal. After 5 days, they discharged us with oral antibiotics and a follow-up appointment for the next week. 3 weeks later, we sat in family court for the 6-month review of our arrangement. Judge Wells read through the stack of reports from doctors, teachers, and social workers while Mason fidgeted with a small toy car in his lap. Bethany testified about the stability of our home and Mason's improved school attendance. The judge asked Mason if he felt safe and happy, and he nodded while reaching for my hand. She approved the continuation toward permanent guardianship with the final hearing set for 2 months out. That afternoon, a certified letter arrived from a law firm in Connecticut. Claire's parents had written to apologize for trying to take Mason away and acknowledged they couldn't provide the medical care he needed. They'd established an education trust fund in Mason's name with $50,000 for college. The letter said they understood Claire's choice now and wanted to support Mason's future, even if they couldn't be part of his present. I put the letter in the folder with all his other important documents. 2 weeks later, Mason stood on the elementary school stage wearing a red polo shirt and khaki pants for the spring talent show. He'd practiced the song Count on Me for 3 weeks, working around his cough and breathing treatments. When the music started, he sang clearly even though he had to pause twice to use his inhaler. The whole 3rd grade class cheered when he finished, and Matthew stood up yelling, "That's my best friend." Mason took a bow and waved at me in the 3rd row. The music teacher gave him a certificate for participation, and he carried it home like it was made of gold. We settled into a routine where treatments weren't emergencies anymore, but just part of our day like brushing teeth or making breakfast. Mason stopped asking when things would change or if I was going to leave. He started calling our apartment home and hung his school pictures on the refrigerator with magnets. The medicine schedule became automatic, and he reminded me when it was time for his vest therapy. His teachers sent home progress reports showing improvement in all subjects now that he wasn't missing so much school. The morning of the final guardianship hearing arrived with Mason wearing his best clothes and carrying a letter he'd written to the judge. We sat in the courtroom while the bailiff set up video equipment for Claire to appear from the women's correctional facility. When her face appeared on the screen, Mason waved and she started crying immediately. She looked healthier than she had at the hotel, like prison had forced her to take care of herself. The prosecutor read Claire's statement, surrendering her parental rights and supporting my guardianship petition. She said she loved Mason enough to let him have the stable life she couldn't provide. When it was Mason's turn, he walked up to the microphone and whispered thank you to his mom on the screen. Claire nodded and mouthed, "I love you," before the connection ended. Judge Wells signed the permanent guardianship order giving me full legal custody, with adoption rights available after Claire completed her sentence in 18 months. Walking out of the courthouse into the bright spring afternoon, Mason tugged on my sleeve and looked up at me with those huge brown eyes. "Can I call you Mom now?" he asked in that quiet voice of his, and I nodded because I couldn't speak past the lump in my throat. We stood there on the courthouse steps holding each other while people walked around us, both of us crying happy tears for the first time in months. The next morning, Dr. Park practically bounced into the exam room with Mason's latest test results, showing us how his lung function had improved by 15% since finding stability with me. He adjusted Mason's treatment plan, reducing some medications because the stress of uncertainty wasn't making his symptoms worse anymore. The following afternoon, Mason and I bought seeds and small pots at the hardware store to start a garden on our apartment balcony. He carefully wrote labels for each plant with names like Detective Rita for the tomatoes and Linda for the sunflowers, saying each person who helped us deserved to grow into something beautiful. 3 days later, Linda stopped by with a thick folder of resources for families like ours, connecting us with support groups and respite care programs. She showed me how to apply for additional assistance and introduced us to other parents raising kids with CF, making sure we knew we weren't alone in this anymore. Within a week, Mason was doing his breathing treatments completely on his own, while I worked from my laptop at the kitchen table, our morning routine flowing smoothly without me having to check Claire's old notes. He'd tap my shoulder when he finished, then settle in with his homework while I made breakfast, both of us moving around each other like we'd been doing this for years. 5 days after that, Mason sat at the desk writing a letter to his mother in careful cursive, including the photo from his school talent show where he'd sung that song about finding home. He sealed the envelope and asked me to mail it to the prison, saying he wanted her to know he was okay and that he forgave her for leaving. At the CF clinic the following week, Mason spotted a scared little girl getting her first nebulizer treatment and walked over to show her his own equipment. He explained how the medicine would help her breathe better, demonstrating his vest machine and making her laugh by calling it his shake and bake routine. By the next week, I realized I hadn't looked at Claire's medical binder in days because Mason's routine had become as natural as brushing my teeth. I knew which medications went with which symptoms, when to call the doctor versus when to wait, and how to read the subtle signs of a flare-up starting. Claire's parents dropping $50,000 in a trust fund right after trying to take Mason away feels pretty convenient, doesn't it? Makes me wonder if they're trying to ease their own guilt or if there's some legal reason they suddenly decided to back off. Mason's teacher pulled me aside at our parent conference to tell me how much he'd improved since the beginning of the school year. She called him their miracle story because his grades had jumped 2 levels once he wasn't worried about where he'd sleep each night or if anyone would remember his treatments. That evening, Mason finished his breathing treatment and curled up next to me on our worn couch with his library copy of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. "Read the part about the mirror again," he said, settling his head against my shoulder while his breathing stayed steady and calm. As I read about Harry seeing his parents in the mirror of Erupted, about a boy who found family in the most unexpected place, Mason's hand found mine and squeezed. His breathing was even and peaceful. No wheeze or struggle, just the quiet rhythm of a kid who finally knew he was safe. We sat there in our small apartment with his medical equipment humming in the corner and his garden growing on the balcony, both of us finally understanding what it meant to be home. Had a lot of fun just wondering about stuff with you today. Always enjoy tossing around questions together. Until next time, stay curious. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.